Alright, welcome to Chapter 21, Revolution, Socialism, and Global Conflict, the Rise and Fall of World Communism, 1917 to the present. And we'll start with global communism. Okay, your AP focus, if you'll remember from Chapter 17 of our book, it described the ideology of Marxism in reference to the Industrial Revolution. Well, this chapter views the full arc of 20th century communism, from the launching of the Russian and Chinese revolutions to the end of the communist policies at the end of the 20th century. And such an approach to communism fits well into the historical thinking skills of comparison and continuity and change over time. So you need to keep that in mind. Now, when approaching the Cold War, and especially when considering the role of nuclear weapons, be sure to focus on the theme of technology. Examine the innovations of the long-running military alliances of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Think about the role of proxy wars, which did not involve full arsenals of either the Soviet Union or the United States. And that should be compared to the total wars of World War I and World War II. Now, the Cold War also involved an ideological struggle. Think about and really examine the differing interpretations of events from either side of the Cold War, especially how each side viewed the political control of countries that were satellites of the other. Stalin's dictatorship in the Soviet Union may be thought of as a different type of revolution than the original Communist Revolution of 1917. The implications for both the industrial and agricultural sectors of the economy were vast because of rapid economic centralization. And also examine the industrial and agricultural policies of the Soviet Union in combination with Chinese policies. There's a snapshot in your book. I can't remember what page it's on. Maybe 1048. 49, maybe 1050, something like that. And that provides you guys with an opportunity to analyze quantitative data. The College Board asks that we expose you students to charts and graphs and statistics as a way of strengthening and diversifying the use of historical evidence. Okay, now governments used propaganda, and that really expanded in the dramatically changing 20th century. Evaluate the different types of communist propaganda, like posters or film, really in order to understand the issues of the point of view analysis and historical interpretation. Okay. I wanted to include this picture here that shows in red the communist-controlled countries as of 1980. I know that was the year that I was born, and I didn't pick 1980. That's just the map that I found. They gave you guys a really good idea of how communism was spreading throughout the tropics, basically, after World War II, but as you look at today's date, or today, 2016, there are only 5. China, Cuba, North Korea, Laos, and Vietnam, both right there. And it's easy to say that North Korea, Laos, and Vietnam have all been heavily influenced by China. Geographically, that makes sense. Okay. Who is the man in the poster, and what role did he play in world history? Well, this is Vladimir Lenin, better known as simply Lenin. He was the Bolshevik leader of the Russian Revolution. Became the iconic symbol for world communism and one of the most familiar faces around the world. So what impression does this picture leave? Well, the poster's point of view is very low, right? Looking up at Lenin as he stands erect and strong, gazing into the distance. His body is angled as if to shield those behind him, like as a protector, and his clothing is respectable yet civilian. His body divides the image between the red of the Soviet flag over here and its hammer and sickle, right? And then the distant fires and darkness here on the right. It's clearly intended to portray Lenin as a strong, powerful leader who is looking into the optimistic future while leaving the dark past behind him. All right, revolution, socialism, and global conflict. So many jokes from the Soviet era highlight the hypocrisy of the communist system. They reflect growing disbelief that the communist system could deliver promised equality and abundance. But the collapse of the communist regime was greeted by many as a promise of liberation. And almost everywhere, communist regimes came to power through war or revolution. And the communist regimes completely transformed their societies and provided a major political and ideological threat to the Western world. This was seen in the Cold War, immediately following World War II, 1946, all the way until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And there was a large scramble for influence in the global South between the United States and the USSR, the two superpowers of the world during this time. And there was a massive nuclear arms race. And then it collapsed. But communism had its roots in 19th century socialism inspired by Karl Marx. European socialists believed that they could achieve their goals through the democratic process, and those who defined themselves as communists in the 20th century advocated revolution. And communism, in Marxist theory, is the final stage of historical development, with the full development of social equality and collective living. And the interpretations of the work of the 19th century philosopher Karl Marx really predicted a path to an egalitarian future utopia, if you will. And societies would industrialize under capitalism, then see revolutions that would take them through the socialism and then on to communism. And this ideology was named after Marx, although he discussed the nature of capitalism and its history rather than spending much time thinking about the future. Now, at communism's height in the 1970s, almost one-third of the world's population was governed by communist regimes. The most important communist societies were by far the USSR and China. And communism also came to Eastern Europe, Mongolia, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Cuba, and Afghanistan. And none of these countries actually had the industrial capitalism that Marx thought was necessary in order for the socialist revolution to take place. And communist parties took root in many other areas, not just in these locations, as you saw by the previous map. And ironically, the revolutions that brought about so-called Marxist regimes happened in pre-industrial agrarian societies, especially like Russia and China, Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba. And this went against the theories of Karl Marx. But nonetheless, the revolutions and a few others established communist regimes, and they called themselves Marxist and communist. Now, various expressions of communism shared common ground. A common ideology based on Marxism, for one, all inspired by the 1917 Russian Revolution. And during the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact created a military alliance of Eastern Europe and the USSR, thus creating the Council on Mutual Economic Assistance that really tied those Eastern European economies to the USSR's economy, and the Treaty of Friendship established between the USSR and China in 1950. Now, relations between the communist countries were also marked by rivalry and hostility. In Western Europe, the United States, and Southeast Asia, and elsewhere, there were communist parties that ran candidates for election. They're also part of the global communist movement. And communism was explicitly international and anti-nationalist. Nationalists and communists remained staunchly opposed political enemies throughout the 20th century. Yet when communist parties came to power, they began to act like typical states. Conflicts broke out between the USSR and its states that it treated like colonies in Eastern Europe. And also between the USSR and the People's Republic of China, despite their treaty of friendship. And that is the end of global communism.